I wanted to go back to those early days. I mean, I think one of the most remarkable things for me reading about the society's birth is the fact that you came together as a fairly disparate group and were told that whatever you were planning to do was not possible and you shouldn't entertain this notion that
that wasn't the group actually, that was me in the first instance. The whole thing started because I have two old friends. Two of my oldest friends have a little farm up in Aberdeenshire, up on the edge of the How of Afford. And I then, as now, I usually go and visit them a few times a year. And their next door neighbour was called Stan. And Stan was a very wealthy Aberdeenshire farmer. And he lived in a wee 2-up, 2-down farmhouse with no sign of affluence, drove an old Land Rover. And what he did have as a luxury was that once a year he went over the Carver to Speyside and then up the Spey to Ballinadalach, where from George Grant he bought a quarter cask of Glenfarclas. Now, the domestic purchase of casks, by that time, we're talking about the 1970s, by that time the domestic purchase of whisky in cask was virtually unknown.
Yeah.
It never died out completely, but it was bloody near it. And let's face it, by the 1970s, malt whisky was known, practically unknown outside Scotland, and very little known within it.
Yeah.
I mean, I was brought up in Grangemouth, where my dad was a docker, and I mean, whisky was Hague.
Yeah.
That's all it was. I mean, it was blended whisky, and I grew up knowing it was our national drink, but frankly not liking the stuff very much. And what really opened my eyes was in the 70s. Stan, when I went to visit the McCardles, Stan would come over with a lemonade bottle of whisky. And what he wanted was to talk politics.
Uh-huh.
And I was only too happy to oblige because I was an active member of the Labour Party at the time. And I thought it was just the best whisky I'd ever drunk, by miles. And I asked about it, and Stan took me up to the house and showed me a wee Aberdeenshire farmhouse kitchen with an armchair on either side of the fire, and beside one of the armchairs was Stan's cask,
his own
with
cask.
a spigot in it.
Brilliant.
And drew his whisky off the cask. But I thought it was just wonderful. And having experienced this a few times, and having experienced the fact that I could get very drunk on it without feeling desperately ill, which was usually happened to me, I asked Stan about it. And Stan told me where he got it and so on. So I got on I told a number of my friends about it. And I said, if I was to get a hold of a cask of whisky, would you be interested? They all said, sure, great. So eventually I got in touch with the Grants and explained who I was and what I'd come across. And this and that, was there any chance of buying a quarter cask of Glenfarclas? And they said, well, as a matter of fact, one of our customers to whom we supply these quarter casks has died, and there was nobody to inherit his supply.
Okay.
So if I wanted, since I knew Stan, I was obviously a sort of respectable person, and yes, okay. So I got my I drove up to Glenfarclas, and I paid the Grants £2,500 for quarter cask Glen, 10-year-old Glenfarclas. And I brought it down to Edinburgh, and I called the chaps together, and we met in the lobby of my house in 10 Scotland Street, and we sucked it out with a plastic pipe and divvied it up. And obviously we tasted it a few times, and everybody thought it was wonderful. So they all went off home, divided it into gallon jars. Mm-hmm. And they all went off clutching their gallon jars, happy as could be. Uh-huh. And it wasn't long before I started getting phone calls from complete strangers saying, "You don't know me, but I'm a pal of so-and-so, and I've just tasted some of that wonderful whiskey. Is there any chance of getting some?" So I would say, "Well, give me your phone number." And I made a list of names and phone numbers. And eventually, the members of the syndicate were coming back to me remarkably soon, saying, "I've run out of whiskey, can we get some more?" So I called a meeting and said, "Look, there's not just you lot, but there's your pals as well. What would you say, if I can get 2 casks, would you be agreeable to enlarging the syndicate?" And they said, "Sure." So I phoned up the Grants and said, "Any chance of 2 more?" And they said, "Well, if you want, yeah, we've got 2 you could have." So I drove up to Glenfarclas. Shortly before that, one of my friends was a man called Richie Calder, an extraordinary character, Richie Calder. He was a pressman. Uh-huh. He was one of the leaders of British propaganda during the Second World War, okay. And I understand was responsible for the da-da-da-da call sign to Europe, okay. Which of course, being the opening bar of Beethoven's Fifth, was also spelled V for victory in Morse. It's the kind of thing Richie did. Okay. And I was I met him not that long before it was around about Christmas. And he said, "When's the syndicate going to happen?" And I said, "Well, pretty soon, I think. Depends on the weather." And he said, "Make it quick, would you?" And I said, "Why? What's the hurry?" He said, "Well, I was in Moscow last week and I had a heart attack, and they tell me I'm going to have more. So, sooner the better." As it turned out, I couldn't go until February. And in the intervening period, Richie died. Oh, geez. But he had left strict instructions that he was chairman of Film House in Edinburgh at the time, and he left strict instructions that if he was to die before he got his gallon from the syndicate, that we were to have a wake at Film House, and we were to use his whiskey. Okay. Which we did.
Nice.
It was wonderful.
Fabulous.
But as you can imagine, well, the thing is, there was a big group of mainly middle-class people in Edinburgh, all involved in the media, the arts, and things there too. And it was a society through which word moved very easily. Yeah. So I suppose it's called networking now. And
but it was clearly word of mouth because no one had tasted anything like this.
Absolutely,
and people might have been drinking blended whiskey. Yeah,
but they'd never come across
this was a revelation.
Quite so wonderful. And
so word of mouth must have been going all over the place. Have you tasted this stuff?
Yeah, and eventually I got I mean, it went on for quite a while, and I went looking for other casks of whisky, although none that turned out quite as spectacularly fine as Glenfarclas. But I got the idea that possibly, I was thinking to myself, you know, why is somebody not selling this stuff? And why is it so much better than the same stuff in a bottle? And this didn't just apply to Glenfarclas. It didn't even particularly apply to Glenfarclas, but it did apply very clearly to an awful lot of other whiskies. And I had a very close friend called John Ferguson.
The climber. He was a climber?
He was a climber, yes. Were you a climber?
I'm not a real climber. I'm a hill walker, and I've done a little bit of climbing. But I read, I think it was in your introduction to Scots on Scotch, and there was an intriguing mention of John Ferguson and Dougal Haston as well.
That's right. Well, when I was young, I was for my sins a mountaineer, and I stopped doing it, I suppose, in my early 20s. I'd had a very bad accident at the age of 20 and spent 3 months in hospital.
Oh.
But I did quite a lot of hard routes after that. And yes, there was and John was a member of the Craig Do.
Right, yeah.
And I remember when I met John, he said, you're called, no, it's Pip Hills, is that right? I said, yeah. He said, were you a mountaineer when you were young? And I said, aye. He said, well, we've met before, and when we last met, you threatened to kill me. Surely not. How was this? And he described a day which I remembered vividly. It was a wet Saturday in Glencoe, and Dougal and I were at a loose end. The rain, it was far too wet to climb any good routes. So we attempted to do what generations of mountaineers had tried to do, and that was to make a girdle traverse across the north face of Anachdo.
Mm-hmm.
A dirty business, but better than doing nothing, sitting in the pub. And we knew there was a couple of guys somewhere up the mountain, further up the mountain, and at one point we heard a rumble, and we dived on, and it was a very vertical face. We managed to get ourselves under an overhang, but with great difficulty, and a rock avalanche swept past us. Okay. Obviously, whoever was further up the mountain had started this. Mm-hmm. And we saw, it took us the rest of the day to get off the face, because we were pretty shaky. And we saw these two, obviously Craig Do, and apparently I shouted at one of them and said, "You bastards, I'll kill you."
And that was Ferguson.
And this is Ferguson, and here I formed an alliance. John liked high jinks. Uh-huh. Now, does that mean anything to you?
Uh-huh.
Parahandy.
Uh-huh.
It's not quite translatable into English.
Yeah.
But John and I got up to some great things together. Mm-hmm. I mean, we had a lot of fun. A lot of it involving boats. I told John about my idea. He was a member of the syndicate.
Right.
I told him, and he said, I need to talk to somebody in the whisky industry, because I knew nobody in the whisky industry. I need to talk to somebody. He said, why don't you try Russell Sharp? He's in the industry. And I said, I don't know him. He said, he's a member of the Squirrels, Edinburgh climbing group.
Okay.
And so a meeting was arranged in the Horseshoe Bar in Glasgow.
I know it well.
And the three of us sat in the Horseshoe Bar. And Russell was the perfect person because he was trained as a brewer and was the head chemist at Shivers. Good job in the whisky industry.
Yeah.
And he was responsible for quality, and he knew all the technicalities of whisky. So I was able to say to Russell, right, why is this stuff so much better? And he was able to explain to me that it was down to two things. It was down to the individuality of the cask, and we had been fortunate in getting good casks. And it was also down to the fact that we were taking it straight without chill filtering, which removed some of the flavour.
Yeah.
So I said, I fancy doing this commercially. There's got to be a market for liquor. I mean, this is Scotland's finest product, and there is no market for it. It's not sold. And it was Russell who said, he said, the industry won't like it. He said, they'll stop you if you use any distillery names because they're all trademarks, so you can't use a distillery name. And he said, they'll try and stop you if they can. But he said, but if you manage to do it, I'd be happy to.
Right.
I'd be happy to be part of it.
Yeah. So did he come on board, or was he just an advisor?
On board. More than anything? He didn't come on board immediately, but pretty soon.
So, but other people within the industry said there's not even a market for this.
Oh, that's right. People I got introduction to various people in the industry, and they all said, "Oh, there's no market for that. If there had been, we'd have done it before."
Yeah.
Which showed how little they knew.
Yeah.
I mean, this was, the main motivation was fun. It was a fun thing to do. Part of it was that the people I spoke to who said it couldn't be done, were so dull.
There was no imagination.
There's no imagination. They were all pulling in big salaries from their companies.
Yeah.
And they were all, they thought that they were selling blended whiskey. And they were surprised that anybody would want malt whiskey. And let me tell you a story about that. David Dykes, I take it you've read David's book. One of the seminal books in the history of whiskey.
Yeah.
When David, in the 60s, mid-60s, when David was doing the research for that book, he went to Bowmore, which at the time was owned by Stanley P. Morrison. Obviously a wealthy man, several generations in the whisky industry. And they showed it. Nobody had ever come to visit Bowmore because nobody thought of visiting distilleries. And they showed him, he explained what he was about and so on, and they were very obliging and showed him round the distillery. And once they'd showed him round, they said, "Would you like a dram?" And he said, "Yes, certainly." So they took him into the sample room and poured him a dram of blended whiskey, of which Bowmore was an important constituent. And David said, would it be possible for him to have a glass of the Bowmore? And Stanley Morrison said, is it nice, just on its own? This is a man who owned a distillery, who never thought to drink the malt on its own.
Yeah.
Now that is astonishing.
Yeah.
It shows how powerful our ideas. Here was almost an entire industry which believed this sort of thing.
Yeah.
Just amazing.
But you've written about how, there was almost a complete ignorance about what we were producing as whiskey, because blends were everything.
That's
And even the distilleries, you know, they may have had good casks or not such good casks. It didn't really matter to them because it was all going into the mix.
It was all going into the one blend, you know. And contrary to what they say, if you're blending 1,000 gallons of whiskey, the fact that there are some exceptional casks is not going to be discernible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there was a great mystique about the choice of whiskies for blending, and like a lot of what the whiskey industry said, a lot of it was bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it took the whiskey industry 10 years to waken up to what we were doing in the Whisky Society, and to realise that here was a huge market at the very top of the market, and one whose existence would reflect well on the rest of the market, on the blended whisky market. It took them that long.
But I mean, you were obviously doing this when availability was, it was a new thing, but was availability of those good single casks, was it easier to source them?
It wasn't only easy to source. People were delighted for me to take the stuff off their hands.
Because they wanted this whiskey to shine in its own, because it come from...
No, because they couldn't get rid of it.
Oh, right, okay. Just because the general state of the market...
They didn't give a toss about the whiskey. What they wanted was to shift it, to get it off their stocks.
Uh-huh.
I remember going to Bond 9 in Leith quite early on to buy Highland Park. And they had lined up about 20 casks of Highland Park with samples drawn off each of them. And we went along the row and nosed them and said, yes, we'll have that, and that. And it was agreed, we signed the paper and so on. And then, I can't remember, the manager said, I've got some old whiskey in the Bond. Would you be interested? And I said, what is it? He said, it's Dallas 2, and it's 25 years in cask. I said, I will. Let's have a look at it. So we went up to the top of the racks, up on gantries and things, and there were 7 casks. 4 were first fill sherry butts and 3 were second fill, and it had all been in cask for 25 years. It was wonderful. It was a lot better than it should be at 25 years in a first fill of a butt, but it was wonderful. So I said, I would, we'll take the lot.
Yeah.
All we paid for was the alcohol. You paid so much per litre of pure alcohol per year. Mm-hmm. That's all you bought. You were just buying alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
There was no addition for the nature of the cask or the quality of the product. It was all one price.
Okay. So sourcing the product in those days was not an issue. And
no.
I was looking at 1983 as the year that the society was officially formed, was the year of multiple closures of distilleries, notable distilleries across Scotland.
People were happy to get rid of stuff.
But even at that time, with the state of the industry, you thought, we've got a market for this.
Well, I knew very little about the industry, remember.
Mm-hmm.
All I was doing was judging on the quality of the product and the response of my friends, who were ordinary middle-class people. Not all of them middle-class by any means, quite a lot of them working class, but I mean, this has always been a middle-class thing because poor folk can't afford to buy expensive whiskey. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, I was convinced that there had to be a market for something as good as this.
Uh-huh.
And there was a social element to it, in that Scotland in the 1960s were undergoing something of a cultural revolution. what was regarded as Scottishness by the 1960s hadn't changed much in a century or more. But there was that part of the population which was aware of itself and had some awareness of its culture, who were aware that Scotland was a lot better than the official view. I mean, the kilt, tartan, haggis sort of view of Scottishness. I mean, the shortbread tin aspect of culture was dominant.
Yeah.
And there were relatively few people who didn't subscribe to that, although it has to be said most thinking people were fairly uncomfortable with it because it was such a lumpen sort of culture.
Yeah.
But it was so, and there was a process of rediscovery. If you read the books about Scottish history, I mean, there was what Marinell Ash called the strange death of Scottish history. I mean, historiography, scientific historiography more or less began in Scotland in the later 18th century and continued for quite some time. But in the Victorian era, suddenly critical history more or less disappeared, and it more or less disappeared for about 100 years.
Yeah.
And modern writing about Scottish history dates, I'm not a historian, but I would say from the 60s, when there was a new generation of historians coming out of the universities, people writing about Scottish history. Not all from the universities, people like John Preble made a huge impact.
Yeah.
And there was also the fact that Scotland was changing its political constitution.
Yeah.
It was becoming much more left-wing. And it has, I'm delighted to say, continued in that vein. What you have to remember is that in the 1951 general election, there was a Tory majority, not just of seats in Scotland, but of votes.
Yeah.
And that gives you some idea of how huge the change which had come about by the later 60s. So there was this process going on of the rediscovery of the real Scotland.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it was conscious on our part, but we were obviously part of that movement.
Yeah.
And we were rediscovering, and the rediscovery was lots of fun, and it was poking a finger up the nose of all sorts of terribly respectable members of the establishment who all adhered to the old ways. And this was part of the motivation, certainly part of my motivation, and I think it was part of the motivation of a whole lot of people, of this sort of aware group of aware people in Scotland.
Well, blended whisky had been the drink of the establishment, hadn't it?
That's right, and it was drunk with in open top glasses with soda.
Yeah.
And
then there was this rising kind of sense of self-confidence in what we were actually capable of producing, what we were producing as a nation, which wasn't being appreciated.
Absolutely, sure.
And you saw the market for that.
Mm-hmm. And I said to the members of the syndicate, look, how about it? I applied to the Registrar of Companies for a company called the Scotch Malt Whisky Society Limited. Now, I had been told very clearly that I couldn't get a company name which implied national status unless it was real. And indeed, Companies House came back to me and said, "What's this about?" And I went back to them and said, "Well, we are a Scotch Malt Whisky Society. As far as I know, we're the only Scotch Malt Whisky Society. Is there any reason why we shouldn't have a company?" And the registrar said, "Yeah, okay," and gave us the company name.
Mm-hmm.
Once we had the company name, we then had to find somewhere to do it in.
Yes.
And I spent quite a bit of time in Leith, mostly to do with pubs and boats and things. And it was a very scruffy place at that time.
Uh-huh.
And I liked old buildings. And at the time, J.G. Thompson wine merchants occupied the vaults and the buildings behind. And I thought that would do fine. And I walked up the stairs one day and asked to see the manager, who was in what's now the tasting room.
Uh-huh.
And the manager, perfectly nice chap, said, "What can I do for you?" And I said, "Well, I fancy your building. Is there any chance of buying it?" And he said, "Well," I don't know. He said, "We're moving out in a month's time."
You didn't know this?
No, I didn't know that at all. All I knew was that if there was a cracking building,
Uh-huh.
it would do just fine. And he said, if you made the firm an offer, I think they'd be happy to get it off their hands.
Was the building condemned at the time?
No,
But it was in
It was.
poor repair.
it was in pretty poor repair. So I told the members of my syndicate, of whom 4 or 5 said, well, if you want to, we'll chip in for it. So we chipped in £10,000 apiece, and we bought the building for £50,000. It turned out to be a disastrous speculation because it cost a fortune to restore it. I got historic building grants and all sorts for it, but even so, we lost our money.
Uh-huh.
But fortunately, by the time the building company went down, we were doing well enough with the society, which was operating from what's now the tasting room with holes in the floor.
Yeah. I spoke to Anne Dana
You
recently.
spoke to Anne, yeah.
And she filled me in on the circumstances, the
Oh,
conditions.
Anne was a stalwart at that time. I had wanted a secretary, because I had a business as a tax accountant, which I ran from my house in Scotland Street, fixing income tax for people and companies and things. And I'd advertised for a secretary, and Anne turned up, and she seemed a very personable sort of person. And I said, well, there actually might be more to this job than being my secretary. And I explained to her what was in the air, and she thought it was a great idea. So eventually she came in and ended up running the thing.
Yeah. First managing director, wasn't she?
That's right, and she was very good, and did it in very difficult circumstances. And my reasoning was simply, if this stuff is as good as we think it is, people will make a path to our door.
Mm-hmm.
So we set up business in the vaults, and there was a wee bottling plant down on Commercial Street in buildings belonging to, if I recall rightly, Glenmorangie. I think it was. Glenmorangie were headquartered down there at that time, and they agreed to do our bottling, single cask bottling plant, and to hold the stuff in bond. And we just set up business. Mm-hmm. And what really started it was an article in the Scotsman. Conrad Wilson, he's dead now, but Conrad Wilson was the Scotsman's food and wine correspondent.
Yeah.
And he had a bunch of his pals who did wine tastings for fun, mostly journalists, and Conrad wrote it up in the Scotsman. And Conrad was a pal of my business partner, Penny Craig. And I told Conrad about it, and he said, well, how about if we do a whisky tasting? So I set it up. And this was probably the first amateur whisky tasting
Yeah.
ever to happen. And Conrad And they thought it was just wonderful.
Uh-huh.
And they scored everything in points out of 100. And the highest they had ever scored was a Chateau Talbot, I think, which they had rated at 87. And they rated our whiskies, and the lowest one got 95, and the Highland Park got 99.
Fantastic. But nothing like this had ever happened before. There wasn't even
absolutely.
such a thing
Completely
as
new.
a whiskey tasting. No one had been sitting around nosing
right.
a blended whiskey
That's right.
or even a single malt.
And I can't remember exactly where the idea of treating it as you would a wine arose. But I think it probably, clearly professionals in the industry had used nosing glasses. We got ourselves a lot of nosing glasses. I imagine Russell probably had a lot to do with that.
Because, I mean, you were a mixed bunch of people.
Oh, very much so.
My understanding is.
We got the idea that we had to write tasting notes. I think we got that from Conrad and his group. And I thought, how am I going to do this? I can't go to the whiskey industry, who presumably would know about it, about such things. I thought, probably best to get people who know whiskey, but who are literate. So I convened a meeting of the first Scotch Malt Whisky Society tasting committee in the kitchen of my house in 10 Scotland Street. And it was a motley bunch. Russell was there as the technical expert. I asked Hamish Henderson, well-known whisky buff, but also very distinguished man of letters, arguably one of the most important people in that Scottish Renaissance. I asked Willie Gillis, who was the professor of Celtic at Edinburgh.
Okay.
I asked my pal Ian Duffield, who's a historian, and I asked Bernard Crick. He had had a distinguished career as a professor of politics at London University mainly.
But that was your first tasting.
That was the first tasting committee, and I asked them. I said, right, pour drams all round. I explained to them what they must do is sniff it first, and then put some water in and talk to me about it, give me words. They were, by and large, pretty useless, despite my care in selecting them. Hamish, poet, songwriter, should have been brilliant. I said, right, Hamish, tell me about it. How would you describe this whisky? Oh, he said, it's a lovely whisky. Just a lovely whisky.
And you're like,
okay, tell me more about it. He said, it's a very lovely whisky. And I could get nothing out of him except it was a lovely whisky.
But the language didn't really exist in terms of describing whiskey at that point.
We decided just to use kind of metaphorical descriptions. I have to say, the tasting committee wasn't a huge success over the years. It was very difficult to find people with the right kind of qualifications and the right, and it all tended to become a bit routine. In latter years, I ended up just doing it myself, and I don't think it suffered for that.
Yeah, but at that time again, this was something that hadn't been done before, and whiskey hadn't been written about in this way. So you did start something which has carried on in whatever path it's taken. Sure. But at that point, it didn't really exist.
No.
To describe a whiskey.
No.
That was a new thing.
And I think the first attempt at it was definitely Conrad Wilson and the Scotsman tasting team.
But so it wasn't really, although someone may have great literary qualities and
It
poetic
doesn't
imagination.
follow that they can describe a whiskey.
Yeah.
But what really made the business fly in the first year was I took it upon myself to do the publicity.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, no, one thing must be clear is we do not pay for advertising in any shape or form. And I had fights on the board year after year on that. I mean, the board was a battleground throughout the whole of my time there, because I had a very clear vision of what it ought to be. And while commercially I may not have been a great success, at least I was clear about the main guidelines. And I said, if it's as good as we think it is, we can get it to sell itself. And I phoned up Jancis Robinson.
Mm-hmm.
This must have been in the first year, I would say. And she wasn't very keen at being a cold caller, but I explained, I mentioned one or two people who were mutual acquaintance, and so she agreed to listen to me. And I told her, as briefly as I could, what it was and what I was doing. And she was fairly sceptical, but she agreed to see me. I said, look, give me half an hour of your time, and if you're not completely convinced, I'll go away and I won't bother you again. And I'll leave you some very good whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
And so I packed a bag with half a dozen bottles. By that time we had spread the net a bit wider, and I went down. She had a house somewhere in North London, and went to see her. And I told her what it was about, I told her how it would come about, and I said, right, what we're doing is treating whiskey as though it were wine, and describing it and so on. And she was completely sold, and wrote a big piece for the Sunday Times magazine, and that just caused the whole thing to explode.
Yeah, but there was no advertising at all. It was just
None
it was
at all.
word of mouth, and then some very positive press coverage.
It was press.
Uh-huh.
Paul Levy rang up to say, what was all this about? And I told him. And I said, come up. And, well, show you. Now, Paul Levy at the time was the wine correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. And sort of very much Jewish intellectual. And a snob. In the best sort of way. A very good opinion of himself, but also very high standards. And Paul came up with a photographer, and I had arranged to take them round a few distilleries and to show them a few drums as part of the thing. And I did. Now, at the time, I drove the same car for 25 years.
Lagonda.
It was a Lagonda, 1937, 4.5 litre Lagonda. I've got photos of it somewhere.
Right, fantastic.
I found some quite.
Well, I was interested to know if you had any pictures of the Lagonda carrying whiskey.
The file that's here is. Anyway, it was a spectacular motor.
Uh-huh.
And it was quite early in the year, sort of March. And Paul was very sceptical, and I think he was regretting having allowed himself to devote 2 or 3 days to this. And he thought better of it, because I took them to lunch at Cushy's Indian Restaurant in Edinburgh.
Mm-hmm.
Now at the time, Cushie's was up in Lothian Street. Now, Cushie's Indian Restaurant is still there in Drummond Street.
Yeah, I don't know.
Opposite the Festival Theatre.
It was established in 1947. It's the oldest Indian restaurant in Scotland in 1947 because there were so many people from the Indian subcontinent coming to study at Edinburgh Medical School.
Right, okay.
And it was only a hop and a skip from the medical faculty. And it was Mrs. Cushie who did all the cooking in big pots, and it was hash slinging of the crudest sort. And I took Paul there, and you could see the nose turning up. I mean, he hadn't been in a dive like this in a long time. And he came out completely convinced. He thought it was wonderful, as indeed it was. Anyway, we set off and we drove up the A9. Somewhere north of Abbey Moor, I screeched to a halt because I'd seen something lying in the road, and ran back down the road and came back very pleased. And Paul, who wasn't very much a city boy, said, "What on earth is that?" I said, "It's a hare, and it's a big one, and it's still warm." It had been killed, and it was early enough in the year, it still had its white coat. I said, "When we get back, I'll cook you here." Chucked it in the boot. And we drove up to Speyside, went to Ballinadaloch, and went to one or two other distilleries. Next day, on the way down the A96, I did the same thing. Drew to a halt. 2 pheasants killed by the same car, in with the hare. And when we got back, I invited Paul and his photographer to come to the house for dinner that night. And I made them a stew. I bought a big slab of belly pork and made them a game stew of hare and pheasant. And Paul said afterwards, he said it was the stew that did it. And we got a complete page in the Wall Street Journal.
Fantastic.
Now, can you imagine the cost?
Yeah.
And there were lots and lots of sort of lesser things of that sort. And that's what took the society off.
Yeah.
So,
how important was the social element of the society, do you think?
enormously.
Obviously, the whiskey is fundamental, but in terms of the social
it was enormously
aspect,
important because we made friends of all the, of the members. The members felt they were members of a club and they were all, and I think Aunt Dana was very important in that. She was a very warm personality, and the members loved her, and they were astonished to find a good-looking woman running an outfit like this. And yes, it was very important. And there was also, I think what was also the important was the whole atmosphere of the thing. It started with a sense of fun, and it continued with that sense of fun and of doing something that dull, respectable people wouldn't do.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure most of our members were dull, respectable people. It was what's called aspirational marketing. They couldn't be us, but they could associate with us by being a member of a society.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's still like that, but that was one of the hardest things to do, because the members of the board, the people who joined, and I have to say I was very easygoing about such things. I mean, my attitude to membership of I didn't even make myself chairman to start with. We had 2 or 3 chairmen which I had to get rid of, because the association with whiskey, very large in the minds of a lot of people, very big social association. People saw it as a sort of upper class thing to do because whiskey was such a big industry and it was largely run by upper class people. And the result was we got, as directors, we got a lot of very dull people. And I think throughout most of my period at the Society, it was something of a struggle to keep the sense of fun and the jollity of the whole thing against these people who wanted to be able to parade their expertise in this wonderful liquor. And I was saying, bollocks, you know, it's good grog.
Yeah.
You know, it's lovely, it's wonderful.
Well, none of you had come to it from the whiskey industry. You were outsiders,
That's
basically.
Right.
And that's the way you wanted to be perceived.
Yes. But we did get quite a lot of people with a bit of money who bought into the company and became on the board and who wanted us to start selling blended whiskey.
Uh-huh.
There was a big movement at one time
Right, okay.
to sell a Society blend, and I said, absolutely not, you're nuts. This is completely inimical to the whole raison d'etre of the thing.
Mm-hmm.
But they said we can make money by it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if I'd paid more attention to making money, I'd have been a richer man today.
Yeah.
But that's the way it went.
But you know, it's clear that the Society has had a big influence on the wider whiskey world.
Oh yeah.
And a lot
all
of
the stuff you see in the airports for hundreds of pounds.
Yeah. You know, in many ways, it's influenced the whiskey world. How do you view that? Is it imitation is the sincerest form of flattery?
Absolutely.
Along those lines?
Yes. Yeah. You know, it doesn't matter a toss to me, frankly, because flattery has never been anything that that excited me particularly. But
when you reflect on what you started and where the industry has gone now, how does that make you feel?
Well, firstly, the whiskey industry, like so many industries, has no historical sense, which is astonishing given what it is. But each new generation wants to make its mark and writes its own scenario. And I'm sure that if you scratch most people who are selling fancy cask whiskies around the world and ask where it came from, most of them won't know, I don't think. I may be wrong about that, but I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think each company creates its own mythos. And the bigger the company, the more powerful that is.
Yeah. I maybe hesitate to ask, but do you have any assessment of the Society now as it is, or do you have any...
I don't know enough about
No.
it.
Okay.
As I say, by the time I came to leave it, I had already grown a bit bored with the whole thing. And, I mean, you can only stand up doing whiskey tastings so long, and you've done it before.
Yeah.
It's a nice thing to do,
Yeah.
no question about that.
But there are other things to do.
And I decided that by far the best. I think I've only ever been in the Society once or twice since I left it.
Can you remember the last time you were there?
Yes, I went in. I can't remember what it was for. It was a few years ago now. And there was this man at the door in a fancy uniform. Sort of London club, gentleman's club, doorman's uniform.
Right.
And he asked to see my membership card, and I said, I've no idea. And he said, did I by any chance know my membership number? And I said, well, I wasn't very sure, but as far as I was aware, it was 1. And he was very nice and let me in. I can't remember what it was for.
But did the penny drop and he was like, oh, I know who you are now?
I think it did, but
yeah.
But feel a wee bit. I think it was Groucho Marx quotation, who asked about being membership of a club, and said, I wouldn't want to join the kind of club that would have me as a member.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying I feel that way about it,
Yeah.
but I rather doubt whether it's the sort of thing that I would be attracted to
Yeah.
as a person.
Yeah. Finally, Pip, any reflections on the society at 35 years of age?
Not really, because I haven't, as I say, I've only, I think, been there once in the last 10 or 15 years.
Yeah.
And so I know very little about it.
Yeah. But could you have imagined at that time in the late 70s and then in 1983 when it was formed that it would...
I never gave it a thought.
No, but it's had this major influence on the industry, and
yes, I didn't foresee that. Well, I could see it happening once we'd been in business for a few years. Quite early on, United Distillers brought out what they called their Classic Malt series.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, their head of marketing was Mike, I think, Collins. And he came for a dram on society, and I said, "You bastard, you stole that idea from me." He said, "Yeah, there's no copyright in good ideas." I said, "The least you can do is to let me have product," because at the time United Distillers wouldn't give us product. And they had that for a long time. But they were sitting on wonderful stock, and the only thing they knew to do with it was 5 classic malts, which weren't that great, frankly.
Yeah.
And they were trying bright new wheezies, like, what was that black whiskey they brought out?
Oh, yeah.
That was awful.
Yeah.
It was packs of red casks. Loch Du.
Loch Du, yeah.
It was hellish.
Which has become a collector's item because it was so bad, I think.
Don't ask me what I think about collectors.
Yeah. No, we'll not get into that.
I think you've got to be some kind of moron to collect whiskey.
But I think, from my point of view, that when you talk about the lack of knowledge about what we were sitting on in terms of the quality whiskey that was in Scotland, and there was no awareness of it, but there was that rising self-confidence that you were talking about, that finally there was a kind of exploration of what we had in terms of quality, and that was really revolutionary on reflection. Maybe it didn't seem like that at the time.
Yeah. Yes, it was a very small revolution.
Small but very worthwhile.
Well, the thing is that emerging consciousness of Scottishness, I think, started as so many revolutions do among what loosely you might describe as the intellectuals.
Mm.
And it took a long time to percolate down to the commercial classes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure, and to tell the truth, I'm not sure it ever did, as far as some of them are concerned.
Mm-hmm.
But there is no doubt that it was a social movement which resulted in us getting a Scottish Parliament. And my main reason for writing it was to lay down a marker, because I could see the process of falsification starting already.
Right.
People rewrite history or they ignore it, and these forces are still present.
Yeah.
Which is why I think history is important.
Yeah.
People, you have to know where you've come from.